Good morning. Okay. This is okay. Okay. Great. Good morning, and thank you all so much for waking up so early towards the end of the COP. So we'll get started with the session. And we have some people also attending online, and we hope a few more will join us this morning. But we have Aditi who will be moderating online. And Aditi, can you hear us? Okay. So over to you.
Yeah. Hi, good morning. I know it's towards the end of the COP. All of you are exhausted, so special thanks for making it so early in the day. While online moderation is not the ideal, but circumstances are what they are. So welcome again for this session. Today we are discussing about the latest progress in the GGA, and I think it's very, very timely given that a new revised text dropped last night. And because discussions are going on so actively, it is also we have lost two of our speakers because they are actually in the um, uh, uh, negotiation team right now, so they couldn't make it. And so the main issue that we are going to discuss today is around the global goals on adaptation and how do we measure and track it. And given that the discussions are ongoing, we will also try to get an update on what's happening right now in this discussion. So just to give you a update, right now the draft that was made available yesterday, it is good to see that there are important words that are included, and there are inclusion of the concepts that have come from the IPCC and the science in general. But obviously, we still have some way to go before it is an acceptable text. And for us, many of us in the sectoral spaces, such as the agri-food system where we work in, I think sectoral targets are also important. So those sectoral targets have been downgraded a little bit in the new text. But what's most important for developing countries for which the CGIAR works and our partners also work is really around the means of implementation, and that and together with finance is something that's not quite there yet. In the context of why agri-food system, why we are CGIAR is the world's largest publicly funded organization that works on agriculture and in the agri-food system space. Why are we interested in global goals on adaptation? Because the requirement in this sector for adaptation is the highest, because ours is the sector that is most climate and weather exposed. I mean, nothing else is as weather exposed in terms of occupation as agriculture, livestock, and fishery are. So this is a direct need of our clients, who are the smallholder producers and pastoralists. So therefore, we feel a particular stake that this particular negotiations and the text results in something that directly benefits the smallholder farmers. So with that little bit of a background, what I really wanted to come to our panelists today. We have a very illustrious panel who have all been deeply involved in this space, either through the negotiation process or from the civil society side, or as researchers, um, or from the funding side. So I will introduce the panel. We don't have our first speaker, Kulthum, who is a negotiator for the Africa Group of Negotiation, but they are obviously in a negotiation meeting that takes precedence. So we will not have Kulthum to set the scene. But what we do have are our other panelists, whom I will introduce one by one. So you can just wave your hand to the audience and to me. So our first panelist today is Cristina Rumbaitis del Rio. Cristina is a senior advisor, adaptation and resilience, UN Foundation, and she has been doing an amazing work on behalf of the civil society in getting a group of like-minded people on the discussions around GGA. And that group has been very active and has been feeding important science and advocacy information to the larger civil society who work in this space. Our second panelist was Christopher Tressos. He was an IPCC lead author, led the Africa chapter, as well as the director of Climate Risk Lab, Africa Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town. But Chris is also involved in a delegation discussion that's happening right now. And he assured me that if it gets over on time, he will be back here. Chris is supporting the Africa group and particularly South Africa in the GGA related discussions. Our third panelist is Zinta Zomers. Zinta was recently elected as the IPCC Working Group 2 Vice Chair. And Zinta also was a author in the last cycle, AR6 cycle, including in the special report on land, as well as she was a co-writing team author in the synthesis report, in which I had the very good opportunity of working closely with Zinta, and she is very active in this space. She also works with the UN. Our fourth panelist today is Emily Beauchamp. She is the lead monitoring, evaluation, and learning of at the International Institute of Sustainable Development, and her expertise is around MEL systems, particularly how MEL systems can work in the GGA, given that the emphasis on MEL-related indicators. And our last two speakers are Lucy. Lucy Juguna is from, works with the CGIAR, and she's based in Nairobi. Lucy was also at the COP, but she went back this week, so she's joining us online. Lucy is a postdoctoral fellow, and a lot of her work is around practical tools and indicators that can support adaptation. And our last but not the least speaker is Stephen Prager. Stephen is a senior program officer for agricultural transformation strategy at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And Stephen and his group has been supporting various actions around global goals on adaptation for the past few years. So with that, I will now request our speakers. I suppose they're already on the podium. Actually, I do not see that screen. If Emma, if you can help me see the screen of our participants, I just see ourselves on my Zoom screen. If that's possible, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, I'm throwing questions in the void and hoping that all of you are hearing me. But if I can see the screen, that would be fantastic. Yes, okay, that works. Okay. Okay, and Lucy and we are hugely looming in the background, right? So yes, but so glad that technology helps us do this as well. With this, we had Kulthum was supposed to kind of set the scene, but we have now requested Christina to talk about the current state of negotiations. But Christina, I have a couple of more questions for you. One is the role of civil society in driving adaptation and tracking progress, and to talk a bit about the work that you are doing through your monthly meetings and gatherings to support this space. Over to you, Christina.
Thanks, Aditi. It's a pleasure to be here in the CGIAR Pavilion, CGIAR FAO IFAD Rockefeller Foundation Pavilion, talking about the GGA, because I think it's important that the different communities of practice be engaged in this process, as esoteric as it might be. In terms of an update, I'll give sort of brief overview. Week one, we really didn't get to have much of a substantive conversation on text. The text that was produced was a consensus text, and so dropped out a lot of the text that developing countries felt was important and had contributed in submissions. And so there were a lot of procedural issues around those texts. Now week two, we're starting to get into a substantive discussion in terms of the different language that different parties want to see in there. The latest text is from yesterday morning. It does include thematic targets, including on food, agriculture, water, ecosystems, also health and infrastructure. But it has, they're not real targets and that they're not time-bound targets, which is problematic for some. And there's also really very weak language around means of implementation, which is code for financing, but also capacity building and technology transfer in terms of achieving those goals. And so that's certainly been very problematic for developing countries and has been highlighted. And then in terms of further work, it proposes a 2-year work program to develop indicators, which is great, and it's important that that process be robust and include observers and experts, and is not just a party-driven process. But there had been other items in terms of further work that many countries wanted to see, like a standing agenda item on the GGA, or a consolidated standing agenda item on adaptation, to really help literally keep adaptation on the agenda of the UNFCCC and the negotiations. Right now, we're waiting for a revised text to come. It was expected this morning. I think you might forgive us if we're all checking our phones during this panel, like love-struck teenagers waiting for a message. But I think we're all just anxious to see what comes next and what comes out of the consultations that were had yesterday, which were really substantive with a lot of different text negotiations happening. And I guess the guesses are that we'll have something by noon, and then there'll be consultations, plenaries in the afternoon. To answer the question you posed to me on the role of civil society, I think civil society is critical in this process, both to observe, to advise, to agitate sometimes, and to really inform, because these are technical issues as well. I'm sure we'll get into this a bit further in the panel, but these targets that we're talking about really matter, and they need to be, well, I hope they really matter. Sometimes I have my doubts, but I'll stay positive. We need targets that really work and that set the stage for what practitioners will be doing, for what the different financing mechanisms will be doing, for what countries will be prioritizing, because there's always going to be trade-offs. And when you're setting a goal and setting a target, that's saying this is a priority that we want to meet. And so it's important that we get that right, and really have strong ambition, but credibility and robustness to that process. And I think that's part of what civil society brings to the conversation. You know, I think it's also important to educate the media on these topics, because, again, it's esoteric, it's a bit difficult to understand. You know, the questions are, why does this matter? What are the implications of this word or that word? And so I think that's another role that civil society can play. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there and let others.
Yeah, we'll have enough time for another round of intervention. So no, that's fantastic. I was keen to know about the group that you have been going now for over a year, and so, but we can hold on that for the next round. So Zinta, again, I am also asking you questions that were meant for Chris, but as well as questions that were meant for you. The first question is and I know you would have no difficulty. I wouldn't have popped this surprise on you if I wasn't confident that you are on top of the science and adaptation. So as a working group 2 author and as a synthesis report author, I mean, you know all that there is that the science says about adaptation. So my first question was, what can be the role of science and research institute networks that are supporting the GGA negotiators? And there is also more specifically demand for IPCC to be more involved. If you will see, I'm not sure, Christina, if the current text also continues that reference to requesting IPCC to be more actively involved. I know the previous text did have that kind of a reference. So given that, how can IPCC help define indicators, targets for the broader GGA? So both an update on what the science says on adaptation, and the role that many negotiators, particularly from the global south, are looking for a more active role of IPCC in tracking, maybe akin to what we already have around greenhouse gas emission inventory. I think some similar mechanism is being asked for by some parties. Over to you, Zinta.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Hope we're a small enough group that you can probably don't even need a microphone. But thank you, Aditi, and thanks for bringing us all together. It's actually very timely, given that I know that I actually believe the COP presidency wants to gavel through GGA maybe even today. So there's going to be a lot of progress in the next, potentially, in the next 12 hours that we need to be following, and it's great to have collective discussion about what's needed. From the science side, obviously Aditi, was also very involved in leading this work for the IPCC, and the IPCC, both Working Group 2 and the synthesis report, finds that, the progress thus far on adaptation or adaptation action is fragmented and not transformative. It's small scale often, and there's questions about adaptation limits, but also about the feasibility of many options beyond 1.5. And as you all know, we are headed in that direction relatively quickly. So I think in terms of the role of science for the next cycle of IPCC reports, we certainly need a broader review of literature. We missed a lot of the gray literature, and that actually means we're missing a lot of what countries are doing that aren't recorded and monitored by scientists. And there's a lot going on in national adaptation plans, in sectors that, for example, I come from the humanitarian sector, and we invest $2 billion a year in activities, many of which actually are adaptation relevant, if not adaptation themselves. So just assessing what is actually going on, and then looking at kind of a broader range of sectors. We obviously speak of adaptation in the IPCC report. We had, for example, water and food and health, but we didn't look at industry and energy and how those sectors need to adapt as well. And that's something that came up in the synthesis report, where there are a lot of gaps. So we have much to do. In terms of the IPCC requests, it's, to be fair, it's popping up not only in the GGA, but also in the global stocktake. So we've seen a range of requests from organizing workshops, and that was again articulated yesterday in the plenary on GGA, to requests for having a new technical task force, to requests for having a special report on adaptation, which to me just personally seems odd, given that we already have the Working Group 2 on adaptation. But so there's a range of, from special reports to having task forces and inventories, to updating guidance, to workshops. And I think the IPCC as a stand is waiting to see what plays out, because obviously we are here to help serve governments, and so we'll wait and see what emerges in the final text, be that in GGA or in the GST. It would be helpful if they're not contradictory, that the GGA asks for one thing and the GST another, and also recognizing that in order to do a lot of this, it's again the means of implementation. Just as in the GGA, the IPCC would need additional funding to do much of it, and that might be the constraint. Again, just on a personal level, knowing how the Bureau operates, I will say that there are in this current Bureau a lot of mitigation and Working Group 3 experts. So I personally would very much welcome a call for stronger representation of adaptation in the IPCC Bureau. And if that is through having a task force where you have additional elected members with this expertise that can help look at some of these metrics and how we quantify or measure things, I would welcome that. But that's just personally, I'm not saying that on behalf of the IPCC. So I'll end there.
Thanks, Zinta. So what you were saying is that given that the assessments have just ended, there isn't a lot of new literature that can go into the special report. On the other hand, perhaps having a special report, I'm just throwing this out, would encourage people to publish more literature around the gaps, because that's kind of what happened with the 1.5 degree special report. There was almost no literature on 1.5 when it started, and then literature just blossom. So I think it might be important to think about those knowledge gaps, particularly around effectiveness and feasibility.
Yeah, I mean, if I can quickly just jump back in, yeah, very much agree that the effectiveness feasibility needs to be further assessed. But we also, just to note, there are a variety of topics circulated for the special reports, including on tipping points, loss and damage, carbon dioxide removal. So we're trying to avoid having another cycle where we have too many reports. And either if this material goes into the special report, or if not, we certainly need it for the working group 2 report. So I think either way, researchers need to start getting active and publishing again and filling some of these gaps in knowledge.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, that's completely fair. And later, Zinta, I'll come back a bit more if you can unpack the working, the kind of the task force that is being talked about, and where exactly are countries coming from with that request. But then let's wait for the next round. So Emily, your specialization is around monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and those kind of process indicators in the last draft I saw had actually a higher, stronger language than, say, the thematic targets and indicators. So it was all about the implementation cycle. So obviously this is very important from the country perspective, but can you tell us how exactly, how important it is to establish MEL systems, and where are we on that? I mean, how are the countries doing generally their monitoring, evaluation, and learning around the adaptation space? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Aditi. And thanks for this conversation. I think that this is very interesting. So basically, to take a little bit of a step back, actually, the GGA discussion at the moment is effectively a discussion about monitoring, evaluation, and learning. The GGA is establishing a framework that will frame how the GST, how the global stocktake is going to assess collective progress on adaptation. And that is essentially, this has to come from the bottom up. This has to come from a contextualization by countries about what they are measuring, what are their adaptation priorities. So the GGA is very important in getting momentum into encouraging countries in strengthening and revising their monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems in order to have more evidence. And it's great, the IPCC, and I would be delighted if the IPCC would have a task force on adaptation. But they serve different functions, right? So the IPCC can provide science and looks at peer-reviewed literature, etc. But it doesn't necessarily include how interventions and projects and decisions are being made at the very local level, which is where most of the time adaptation pans out. So you really need to have better systems for local authorities, communities, subnational, national governments to look at what works for whom and how in adaptation in order to have and to make better decisions for adaptation. And we need that really, really quickly. We can't actually wait for many years to have more solutions. You need to have adaptive management. You need to have cycles of information that make inclusive, participatory, and better informed decisions now. Now, so we're really looking, that's part of the importance of adaptation, is to bring visibility. The GGA is to bring visibility on adaptation in the normal policy cycle. And we're seeing this being done more and more by countries. So at the moment, one of the research outputs of the NAP Global Network is called NAP Trends. And we know from that there's 51% of countries that have NAP documents that mention and include monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems in their NAP document. Now, that, you may think, that's not a lot. That's like almost 1 or 2 countries only. But actually, we know there's also 100, and if I get my facts right, 139 developing countries that are currently working on their NAP processes. And a big majority of them are including work on monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So we can see that countries are really taking that to heart, and the GGA having one of the dimensions as MEL means that this work is only going to increase. But we're really banking, and we really need a strong signal from the GGA in order for this momentum to continue? Because otherwise, information adaptation is going to keep getting weaker. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, yes, no, that's great. And then I'll follow up in the next round around how these dimensional targets interacts with the thematic targets, because I understand all of the discussion is whether these two targets should be at the same level, because the current text doesn't really have them at the same level. But I'll come back to that. Now I'll go back to another online participant, Lucy. And Lucy is a postdoc fellow at one of the CG Centers, Alliance of Biodiversity and CIAT. She's based in Nairobi, and Lucy has been working with her colleagues on practical ways of tracking adaptation. And the reason this is important, and she's speaking in this session, is really before the current draft dropped, there was a lot of discussion whether adaptation tracking adds to a lot of extra work for the global South countries who are already very stretched in different direction. And Lucy is going to talk about how existing systems, data systems, and tools can help us without adding a lot of new work. Yeah, over to you, Lucy. Go ahead. Lucy has a few slides, so I hope you can see them. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Aditi. I hope in the room you are able to see my slides. And I'll go a little bit out of the norm, because I know that the panelists just spoke very well of the slides, but I wanted to show just a few things. And as Aditi has mentioned, for this panel, I wanted to highlight some of the tools that we've been working on as a team at CIAT or within the CGIAR. And because I think these tools actually build on the discussion that has been going on with the speakers that have gone before me, mentioning about the need for targets. There's the issue of not adding additional burden to countries as we aim to have an operational GGA framework, and to see us actually monitoring and understanding the progress we are making in adapting to climate change. And for me, besides highlighting the two tools I'll talk about today, is to point out two key lessons: the value of co-production, and like Emily touched on, the value of making sure that the tools and even the targets that we are developing for the GGA framework actually can help us to move a step ahead in terms of contextualizing adaptation in the vulnerability context, and being able to capture that element of how adaptation is, climate change is experienced by different people, different skills, in different segments of the population. And also the second point around the opportunities to build on existing data systems. One of the key challenges that is often pointed out when talking about adaptation tracking is that we lack data. But through this work, we've seen there are actually existing elements that we can build on, whether it's to do with the data that is currently produced by countries, by the private sector, and start to build on that as we then identify what specific efforts need to be taken in order to bridge the data gaps that might be there. And the first tool I wanted to highlight just to bring these 2 points home is one tool that is called TAILS. So this is tracking adaptation in livestock systems. And this tool was developed with financial support from the German government through GIZ. And now we are actually advancing this through the Livestock and Climate Initiative of the CGIAR. And the tool itself is designed to enable the governments of Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia to track adaptation specifically in the livestock sector. And it was developed through extensive input from livestock keepers, researchers, and governments. And this is that element of co-production that we got to understand what elements, for example, matter more in one livestock production system. For example, when you look at pastoralists compared to, for example, highland systems, and then to also capture that element of what government is doing to support adaptation and how that interacts with the adaptation efforts of livestock keepers. And through this process, we've come up with about 96 indicators that capture 3 main dimensions. One dimension looks at the impacts, the climate change impacts. So this aspect of being able to capture the diverse climate change experiences across different livestock production systems or even different scales, being able to capture the adaptive efforts, whether it's the investments into infrastructure by governments or private sector vis-a-vis what livestock keepers are doing. And then an element that then enables us to understand the progress in adaptation in terms of how do these efforts help us to reduce the impacts of climate change. And these 96 indicators are brought together by a composite index that then is put into this tool that then the government can be able to observe the adaptation progress across space and time. And if anyone is interested to learn more about this tool, I'd be happy to share some of the interfaces that go into this tool. But at the moment, you need credentials to access it because it's meant to be used by government officials. And as the last element is that the tool itself is meant to be integrated into existing government systems. Then the second and last piece is some work that we've been doing, and I think Zinta mentioned the opportunities to capture data that is in the gray literature on what is happening in terms of adaptation. And we had a small project that we were working on to pilot the harvesting of data that is currently highlighted online of the ongoing projects to understand who is acting where in terms of the ongoing projects on adaptation, the kind of investments that are going in, and maybe what are some of the results. But the element of the results is not readily available. The information is not readily available online. And so to bridge this gap, we've also gone ahead to look into how can we then develop a system or a mechanism that allows us to actually be able to assess the adaptation efforts and the results that are coming out of that. And this, we've been looking at 10 African countries that have developed climate smart agriculture investment plans, and to highlight the priorities that are captured in these plans, then to go ahead and develop generic impact pathways that can be used to track the investment plans, identify the relevant indicators that correspond to those priorities, and then go ahead to develop tools that can then practically be used to track these investments. And we've done this, besides working on these 10 countries, we've gone ahead to, I don't know if you can still see my slides. The last one is to go ahead and be able to actually contextualize this framework into the case of Morocco, where they have identified conservation agriculture as the main approach they're using to advance adaptation. And so is to take this generic framework of working from the investment plans to identifying the actions and the impact pathways, to then see how can we develop a specific tool or mechanism that can be used to track conservation agriculture in Morocco. And through this process, we've actually managed to develop a monitoring and evaluation strategy for Morocco that, again, I'm happy to share more details on this. But this is just to show it's possible to move from the current maybe stalemate in the discussions on the GGA framework to actually show we can support countries and other actors to develop practical tools that they can use to track adaptation, and then see how can this feed into the global evaluation of adaptation process. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. But this does seem like a lot of work. So it would also then involve some amount of need for capacity building or workshops to help with the countries can do it on their own, right? Or what are the plans like?
Yes, exactly. And this is just maybe more of a starting point because, for example, with the TILS tool, some of the work that we've earmarked for next year is to actually support governments to use the tool, for example, to include livestock components into their BTRs. And again, with the second piece, this is just more of a pilot, and we're looking forward to see how can we even, for example, as CGIAR, can we be able to even apply some of these generic frameworks that we are developing to evaluate how we're contributing to climate action. So there's definitely a lot of work that lies ahead, but this is just to demonstrate that with the current thinking and the science that we have behind these tools, we can actually be able to advance the discussions, especially with this bottom-up approach where we are figuring out how to track adaptation at a national and organizational level and then feeding it upward.
Yeah. Thanks, Lucy. And this is now very timely that I move on to Steve. Steve Prager is from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and BMGF has repurposed his whole strategy and focuses much more deeply on adaptation, given how underfunded this entire sphere is. So Steve, two questions. Can you talk us a bit more about the reorientation, if I may say so, of BMGF to move towards the adaptation field? And the second is, more specifically, how are you supporting the GGA discussions that are going on right now through various activities, and including research, of course?
Yeah, thanks very much, Aditi. It was interesting to hear the first set of speakers, and then Lucy's point as well, that there's a big challenge here around implementation, and in particular the means of implementation. We're struggling against very limited resources, and any contribution, whether it's from the Gates Foundation, from the private sector, it's just a drop in the bucket at this point in time compared to the magnitude of the challenge that we're actually up against. And so we're trying to be fairly strategic in terms of our approach to integrating climate adaptation into our agriculture development portfolio. Our emphasis has been for the last several years on inclusive agriculture transformation. And in that, there's a recognition that transforming agriculture systems includes with it adaptation as an integral component. And now what we've done in the foundation with the commitments that were made at COP last year, and then the commitments again at COP this year, is highlight a couple of sort of key focal areas where adaptation has been explicitly incorporated into the focus of our agricultural development portfolio. Given that there is a huge challenge here and relatively limited resources, the areas that we've been focusing on encompass what we think is, at this point in time, a reasonable sort of multi-pronged strategy. Right now, we have an emphasis on the policy and prioritization side, recognizing that, as several speakers mentioned, a lot of the work is actually locally led. It's happening at the national and subnational level, and that it's very important to work with national partners to understand where there's the most leverage within the national system, given the national budgets, for realizing adaptation-related outcomes in agriculture and food systems. So policy and prioritization is a key area. Another key area has to do with the elevation of voices, assuring that representatives from the Global South are in the dialogue, that there is hopefully eventually a standing agenda item for adaptation in the dialogue, and that again, there is some level of power in the negotiation process among the members of the Global South that are experiencing this, the majority of the effects of climate change and climate variability. Another area that we are very interested in, and it reflects a little bit a sort of what's possible with some of the work that Lucy highlighted, is this a sort of systematic characterization of what works where, when, and why, importantly, in the adaptation context. That's a very critical piece, and there's a lot of research to be done. But to look at that research in a way that feeds into these global level processes. Just because you can understand and characterize something at the national or subnational level doesn't mean that automatically translates to clear understanding of how much progress you've made on your national adaptation plan. Another key area that we're very interested in has to do with equity, and it's this idea that we need to assure that the adaptation benefits are actually reaching this small-scale producer, the farmers and the livestock keepers, and very importantly, and I think this is something that gets lost in the shuffle a lot of the time, is that those same individuals and civil society members are not disproportionately burdened with the risk associated with adaptation-related activities. Oftentimes there's a cost to adaptation. If that cost is borne exclusively by the most downstream part of the system, then again, the risk is disproportionately borne in that part of the system as well. And then finally, and this was a point that came up indirectly, but also in conversation prior to the meeting, there's a really important question about whether or not financing and resources that are flowing into adaptation are additional resources, or if they're being drawn from somewhere else. And this idea of additionality is a really key consideration as we start thinking about systematically approaching adaptation in ag and food systems, and it's a core priority of the foundation as well. Thank you, Aditi.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And the last point, I mean, every point you make is super important, but the last point is something I'm seeing a lot of discussions around. The Adaptation Fund has not been able to reach its target at COP yet. And there is actual misgiving that a lot of the funds that have been, say, pledged for, say, loss and damage actually comes from which would have otherwise gone to the adaptation kitty. So there is both an issue of additionality, but there is also the issue of whether funding of the loss and damage fund, which is super important, is actually taking away funds from adaptation. So if you have any reflections on that, I'll like to get back to you. But in the meanwhile, and these questions are something that may not have been something that are already shared, so feel free to I'm going a bit spontaneous here. But at the negotiation rooms, I saw, and this is for you, Christina, but for anybody else can take it too. In the negotiation rooms, I have seen that we as researchers have put forward terms like we need transformative adaptation. We have also said a number of times that maladaptation is a real risk. But in the negotiation rooms, whenever I talk to the Global South negotiators, they say, oh, we don't know what transformative adaptation is. Can you give me an example? And we all struggle, we struggle with that. Zinta, you know very much, we struggle with that during our approvals as well. So can you provide guidance to as practitioners, provide us guidance to how researchers, these terms then actually whether it helps or hinders adaptation, or how we can do better to come up with terms that are not confusing our negotiators.
Yeah, a very good point. That certainly does come up, and there is pushback from many different corners in terms of what do we mean by transformational adaptation? What is it? What is it not? Is it better than incremental adaptation, or is incremental adaptation really good in certain contexts? And I think part of the challenge is that so many of the examples around transformational adaptation come from the global north, and are at different scales. And there's a request from AOSIS and their proposal to have a piece of work commissioned by the I think it was the Adaptation Committee. Now might be missing my way. Was it? Thank you, Emily. To do an analysis on transformational adaptation, to do a synthesis of the research, to bring examples globally, not just from the global north, and at various scales to unpack the term. But I think that's part of what the research community needs to rise to the occasion on, is doing that research and doing that synthesis and distilling, like, what is that transformational piece? What are the ingredients that lead to a fundamentally different scale and impact of adaptation action, and really provide a breadth of examples. I also think there's a demystification, a translation that needs to happen in both directions, right? The negotiations are pretty hard to understand if you've not been sort of embedded into them. The science is sometimes pretty hard to understand if you're not doing the research or embedded in that community. And so there's a little bit of an interpolation back and forth that needs to happen to really distill, here are the elements that matter, here's how it should be integrated or not into policymaking and decision making. And I think, again, that's something that civil society, the expert community, the IPCC, and others can really contribute to the process. But I'll see if others want to come in on this point.
Thank you. I was just going to say that one of the points related to transformational adaptation in the UNFCCC, well, first, those following negotiations will know that UNFCCC is very skittish in including new terms, even if they're politically defined, like, for example, locally led adaptation that has had a lot of traction. And if you have been following the Glasgow Sharm el Sheikh work program on the GDA, it was present in a lot of the discussions, yet it's not in the text anymore. Similar thing for transformational adaptation that has been defined by the IPCC, but is not defined by the UNFCCC. So there is a need for the UNFCCC to define and own these terms before they're actually put in text. It's sometimes, sometimes they make it into text, but sometimes it can take a bit of time. But the point was, and in the previous iterations of the text, you would see incremental and transformational. And the reason for this is that several developing countries say, that's great that we want transformational adaptation, but what we need, and what we need now, what we need yesterday, is continuous support for incremental adaptation so that we do not have to get to transformational adaptation. So let's not trade off one for the other, just like adaptation is absolutely essential so that we don't get to a huge amount of loss and damages. Thanks.
Right. No, that's a fair enough point around that. So in this, Zinta, if I may come back to again around the task force that's been done, and that is, I mean, a lot of the discussions I've been hearing around in the corridors is that there was in 1998 a reference to an adaptation task force very much akin to the TFI that we have, Task Force on Emissions, in IPCC. So can you tell us what exactly does that emission inventory group does, and what is been? I know it's a bit speculative, but you are an insider, so if you are hearing something concrete, what people have in mind around this task force on adaptation tracking, would it be similar to the emissions tracking one? And yeah.
I'll try to answer, and I know Emily's also been involved actually more than I have in these discussions. As the IPCC, we just try to, as I mentioned, wait and see what comes out before weighing in. But my understanding is, yes, that this task force would ideally, we know that there are many different, for example, indexes of vulnerability to climate change, and it would try to help compile some of this, maybe identify which ones should be used publicly, help with, potentially tracking of some of the systems that Lucy mentioned. In the task force for emissions also often organizes workshops, for example, if you have questions about how you would account for your emissions from peat, if you actually use the peat to fertilize, as fertilizer in fields, is that, how do we count that? How do we track that? So these kind of task force have the ability to work with scientists to also try to clarify technical questions around emissions, and that's what exists now. So it'd be the same. So for adaptation, if we had technical questions, maybe questions about how do we know that adaptation is effective over the long term versus the short term, it could help with those type of things. Of course, this is all speculative, and it would need, in order to be effective, funding of some form, because usually there are several. Governments would have to nominate people to be on this, so it's the current task force of greenhouse gas inventories has, I think it's 6 representatives from around the world. So it certainly would, as I said, increase the adaptation expertise in the Bureau and in the IPCC, and perhaps could fill a gap. But that's something that the governments would have to identify as needed. And until then, we just stand ready to help as directed.
That sounds very good. And also the proposal in the current text is around, I'm confused about the exact terminology, but one of you just put the right words into my mouth, but there is to be a 2-year kind of effort to develop indicators. So is that correct? And how is that being envisaged? And that question is open to any of you deeply involved in the negotiation. That would also involve interdisciplinary teams drawn from research community, from civil society, etc. So I don't know who would like to take this. Emily, Christina, Steve, Zinta, or Lucy for that matter. So yeah, go ahead.
I'm happy to jump in, Ms. Folks. I don't actually know if you see us. I'm like waving at the screen. That doesn't really work.
Yes. I see all of you. Yes.
Great. So at the moment, there is a proposal for a 2-year work program to develop indicators and quantified elements that would be hosted by the SB co-chairs, so under the SBI and SIPSTA. There is not a lot of definition on what the work program would entail. So a lot of calls of both developing and developed countries have been to be for the text to be clearer about roles and responsibilities. One quite converging proposal was for an ad hoc working group to be developed under the co-chairs, which would mean that very similar to the transitional committee, right, for loss and damage. So like the UNFCCC has a long history of creating these committees. This isn't anything new or challenging. But the aim would be that there would be representatives from countries, different constituencies across the UNFCCC, NGO constituencies, and other experts. And this could be done with a fairly quick turnaround. And as Zinta mentioned, one of the problems with the IPCC task force is that it takes quite a while. Well, first, it's really important to remember that UNFCCC has no authority on IPCC. So the UNFCCC can invite the IPCC to do something, but there is this entails no legal or any mandatory obligation for the IPCC to follow. So it's very tricky to actually, you don't want to put your eggs in the basket of inviting the IPCC to do something that you don't actually know if they will pick it up. So a lot of parties are not, whilst they would, I'm sure, be delighted to have a task force on adaptation in general, it's not necessarily in the mandate of the GGA to invite this and to rely on the IPCC to do that. And actually, an ad hoc working group that is based on country representative and other scientific experts, NGOs, would probably be a better, a more legitimate body and temporary body, ideally, to do so. However, we don't have a lot of information from the text right now, so we're waiting on having these precisions. Thanks.
Yeah, I hope the revised text drops soon. But is there anybody? Zinta, you wanted to speak. Go
Well, I
ahead.
just wanted to say that we need to be careful because the parties, the IPCC is also a party-driven process. And in January, we have a plenary where the same representatives, the same governments from around the world, often the same people who are UNFCCC negotiators, will also be there negotiating for what the IPCC should do in the next 7 years. So while I agree with Emily that to some degree it is giving a mandate to a body that's external to UNFCCC, or you don't know what's going to happen if you invite them. On the other hand, it's often the same people, and they are very, very closely linked. So that it's just another for further discussion about this. But yeah, I definitely think the 2-year process. There are points about the 2-year process versus something that's permanent, and who to include that are very important to discuss either way.
So we have, I have just one more question that comes to my mind at this point, and that was regarding the dimensional targets around monitoring, evaluation, learning, which I understand one group of parties are very keen to, and they are kind of have a stronger language now, versus more thematic targets around land, water, food, which also finds a place in the current text, yesterday's text, but they have a little bit of weaker language. So, so does anybody has insights of why this is so? And from our perspective, from the CG perspective, given we work in the agri-food sector, of course, for us, the thematic targets have a particular significance. Not to say that the dimensional targets don't have. So can one of you, anyone, maybe Steve or I don't know who is best suited to answer this, kind of having reflection. Should it be one versus the other, or should both be similar, or what, to play that out a little bit? Yeah.
I'll get started if you want, but it doesn't have to be either or, just like in anything, just such as incremental versus transformational, such as adaptation, loss and damage, etc. The dimensional targets have a more operational value in the sense that what's really needed is, even if you have these 5 themes that are strongly linked to IPCC and that have a more aspirational message on what are some of the key aspects of adaptation that need to be fast-tracked or accelerated. Countries still need to ground their actions in contextualized climate risk assessments to identify what are their adaptation priorities. So the whole basis of adaptation is to have a really strong grounding in what countries need and in their context. So the dimensions provide that value in saying, okay, so let's put an emphasis and let's really flag, give a strong signal with the themes of where attention is needed. However, this may not be necessarily all the themes that are needed in each community or each country. So you need both. And we welcome stronger language on both with MOIs.
Yeah. Okay, that's excellent. With some 3-4 minutes to go, I would like to see, I understand we don't have a lot of audience, it's pretty early in the day and absolutely towards the end of COP, but is there any audience question that the audience wants to pose to this panel? My colleague Emma would be around to take those questions. Over to you, Emma.
Can I actually ask a question real quick, Aditi? I mean, I would love to hear from Lucy or yourself or others around the agriculture and food target that's in the text. Maybe we can read it out for those who don't have the text in front of them. But is that strong enough? Does that have everything you want to see in there? I think it's important to get the input from the technical communities.
Yeah, Lucy, would you like to go? And I know you have a question too. I can come in after you, Lucy.
Yeah? I mean, they can read it out first, so they're all on the same page.
Yes. Oh, I can read it out.
I think it's in your quote, yeah.
Oh, okay. Just give me a minute. I'll just open and read it out.
Oh, we have it here. Yeah, I can read it while you, but I think it's attaining climate resilient food and agricultural production and supply and distribution of food, as well as increasing sustainable and regenerative production and equitable access to adequate food and nutrition.
Yes, okay. I can react quickly. It's a bit of a word salad in the sense that it has got a lot of, I mean, I think the main elements are in there. We were kind of also a bit keen on the food systems, but then because it has been broken down into production, distribution, consumption, that part is fine. Yeah, it could be something simpler, but this is something I'm just reacting off the cuff. But overall, the entire value chain is somehow captured. But yeah, to you, Lucy.
Yeah, thanks, Aditi. And I think for me personally, I'm split between how I feel about this language of the targets at the moment, because I think, as Aditi said, it of course reflects the main elements, but then I don't think it's specific enough, in which case, from a global perspective, this can be seen as a practical way of making sure we are providing, as Emily said, the function of this GGA framework, it's helping to frame how we focus on building resilience and adaptive capacities. Then it's up to us who are working more at the national and the subnational level to identify how do we measure the resilience of agri-food systems and identify ways that then this can be communicated to the global level in a way that helps us to collate the evidence of how, even if it's within the food systems along these different components, we are building the resilience and making sure that we are adequately adapting to climate change. So I think it's sort of a mixed bag for me. So I can see the value of having this language that is broad enough, then operationalizing it more at the national and the subnational level, because what is resilience for one person will be measured differently by another person. And I think also it just shows the value of the idea of having further work towards next year, that then we can get into breaking down these components into more practical elements that can be measured, and perhaps even shows the value of maybe building on some of the work, for example, that I showed, that through these practical tools, we can then be able to identify what specific indicators help us to understand the resilience in the food systems, but then building further to collect the evidence at the global level. Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Lucy. And we had made a submission earlier on that had a bit more of those indicators in targets as well as indicators around food. So Christine, I'll be happy to share that with you. You may have already seen that submission, but I'll share that with you. Now, I think we have almost run out of time. We are a bit minute extra, but I'd like to then move back to each one of you, 5 of you, to give us a 30-second closing remarks. If there is something based on your expectations of what you are hoping to come out as the new text drops, or our journey for the next 2 years as more workforce task force on working group. Yeah, I keep not getting the terms correct on the indicators go on. So we'll start with Steve maybe and move from Steve and Emily, Zinta, Christina, and then Lucy.
Yeah, I don't have too much to
Okay.
add. Mainly just want to thank all of the people who've been working so hard in the negotiation process. I mean, it's a heavy lift. It's a lot of uncertainty, and to the extent that we've seen some success, maybe it's incremental success. Maybe we need transformational success. We're headed in hopefully a reasonable direction. So thanks to everybody who's working so hard on this.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and also to acknowledge some of the support that we are hoping to get through tracking all the adaptation work that we do within the CG through a project called Adaptation Insights. So hopefully, fingers crossed that comes through, and we are able to fill some of that knowledge gap that is our core role as scientists. To you, Emily.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just going to echo something that Lucy mentioned, which is the fact that the GGA is a great framework, but and hopefully it's going to give great signal and momentum, but actually ultimately it's how it gets implemented in countries. So let's not forget the role of governments, but also of practitioners, of scientists, etc., in operationalizing the GGA and making it happen. So action doesn't just come from the UNFCCC. We need to make the action happen. Thanks.
Will Lucy go next? She's in the middle here.
Okay, yes. Lucy, why don't you?
Yeah, sure. I think my closing thought would be something that I picked up from the Adaptation Features Conference of letting not the perfect be the enemy of the good. I know we might not get to where we want to with the adaptation, the GGA framework, but at least if we have something that we can work with, I think then we can lay the foundation to move forward with the great conversations we've had today. There's a lot we can build on. Thank you.
Great. Well, I guess I'll just touch again on the question of means of implementation or finance. I think for me, there's we have big gaps to fill. The humanitarian outlook, for example, is just being launched today, and I think they're asking for about $50 billion just this year to help fill only half of the humanitarian needs. And there's this question of, are governments moving money between adaptation and loss and damage? But I think the reality is governments are moving money between having to balance a lot of needs. Biodiversity targets now by 2030, we need $200 billion per year for biodiversity, $500 billion a year for SDG goals. Then we have, the 100 million here, plus whatever is decided for the next long-term goal, plus the new loss and damage fund. And I think ultimately overarching everything is the question of what means? Is it through special drawing rights or new taxes or levies? How do we get more finance? And I think that is the question that we're going to have to solve to actually get down to the work on the ground as well and make sure that funding reaches communities on the ground. So that's a big challenge ahead for us.
Great, thank you. I would say this is a final push, final few hours. It's really important to get your views out and really push for ambition. Yes, compromises will be made, and yes, we won't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but I think it's still time to push out those key messages around what we want to see in the GGA. And then no matter what happens, we will need to regroup and then come back and work on the indicators. And as Emily said, the rubber hits the road at national and local levels. And so how do we operationalize, use whatever we do have in the form of a GGA to drive forward scaled up adaptation and effective adaptation action. So that would be my 30-second take.
Thank you so much. I think this was a wonderful discussion. This was live stream, and there would be recording that I'll share with all of you. And good luck to all of us for the discussions going on. I think it will be a long day for everybody in the adaptation community, as we will keep our eyes and ears fixed on the new text that comes out and how that's received and finalized. So with that, thank you so much, and have a great day there in Dubai.
Thanks.
So,
Take care.
Thank you.
bye. Thanks.
I know. I was just